My first question. Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting the idea that they're using the fasqi as the tafriq, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, how do you think that happened? Because I think, like, I mean, I'm not trying to say, like, there's, like, real Islamic law
Yeah.
and there's Zanzibar. I mean, I'm just saying, kind of classical textbook law.
Yeah.
Like, fasq would be, like, an annulment because, something invalidated the original contract, like the guy's impotent or, the woman is already married or something. Like, that would be, like, so the idea that, you don't do your job as a husband doesn't cause fasq. That would be grounds for tafriq.
Right.
So how do you think that shift happened where that, term occupied that
Yeah,
space?
I don't know. That's a good question, and I haven't looked at that at all. I'm Elka Stockrider, who has done work on Islamic courts in the 20th century colonial period in Zanzibar. I don't think she addresses that either. I mean, it mentioned this presentation, but she's found, so it's not super recent. Well, for an anthropologist, it's not super recent, but she's seen qadis in Zanzibar town in the 20s and the 40s using khuluu and fasq in exactly the same way. And then, and I think the Al-Farsi manual that I was mentioning before, I think he also, I don't have the passage in my head, but I think he does also use fasq to associate with the husband's fault. So I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know if there are, and I'm not the one to be able to tell you if there are Shafi sources that are making that designation. I haven't looked into that, but that's I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and I would love to know the answer to it. And I'm probably not the one to do that, but just because it is so similar to how tafriq's used in other contexts, I would be curious about that as well. But yeah, good question, but I can't tell you. Sorry. So maybe somebody could do that. Hi.
In any of these types of divorces, does the judge ever order the husband to pay the woman maintenance after the divorce?
Sometimes, that's sometimes. I mean, that's a wonderful question. And the maintenance claims always. I mean, he always, yes, that is, and again, those are the most common claims are for maintenance. And if, and what the husband will, what the qadi will do is he will set out terms of reconciliation, usually to keep the marriage going forward, and then the husband will be responsible for all of the back maintenance that witnesses. If it results in a divorce, not always. So if it results in a divorce, then he's often not responsible for that. And again, I think I sometimes he would have to pay that back, but not always if it ends in a divorce. Maintaining the wife, during the Edda period, never. I've never seen that written into a decision. So, and it's very, I mean, I've asked so many people about that. Women will say that they know that is a legal requirement, that he has, and again, I think it varies depending on the school, but for the Edda period, I mean, women will say that they know that that's a requirement, but I don't know any women who've ever asked for that. I don't know any women who've ever brought it up in court. And usually the response would be like, we know that that's a legal requirement, but it just doesn't happen here. So, and so I think, I mean, just the whole process of opening a case and going to the court, it can be rather grueling. And so I think that it's just not something that I haven't seen women in the courts that I've worked in been wanting to pursue that. But it's possible that it's possible that in the town court where I haven't done a whole lot of work that's more common. I mean, it's easier to get to the court for a lot of women. Women might have more. I mean, often we'll have more resources in town. So it's possible that it's happening there, but I didn't see it in the rural courts yet.
And just one question. I don't know if you looked at this at all, but for the children, does the
qadi at this point kind of determine who's maintaining the children?
That's a wonderful question. So according to Zanzibar norms, they almost always stay with the mother. Almost always. And very few people ever dispute over child custody. And there was one interesting case that I found where a woman who had 5 children with her ex-husband came to court because she wanted her husband to take custody of her children because she was very poor. She just lived in a very tiny little wattle and daub house. There was no room for the children, and she couldn't support them. And so she came to the court wanting to open a case to sue her husband to take custody of the children. And it was absolutely fascinating because the qadi and the clerks were conferring about this, and they said that the qadi told her, it's like, that's not a case. I can't sue someone to take custody of the children. You can only sue for custody. And so what they did was they ended up this is the shows you the benefit of ethnographic research, because what they did is they brought in the husband, who was kind of a deadbeat dad, and his older sister, And they opened a case as if he was suing for custody of the children with his older sister. And so if you look at the court records, it shows that, Mr. So-and-so sues for custody of his 5 children from his ex-wife, Ms. So-and-so. He will support them jointly with his elder sister. But that's not what happened at all. The wife came in because she couldn't support them, and he needed to, lawfully, he had to support them. They were his children, but he wasn't. And she didn't have room for them. And so what they did was the judge, I just remember him saying, that's not a case. I can't open a case where you're suing somebody to take custody of your children. It doesn't make sense. So they kind of reversed it. But in the places where I worked, child custody was almost never. That was the only dispute I ever saw that involved child custody. And it was they almost always just stayed with the mother, no questions asked. So that's a wonderful question, but it's not something I saw people disputing over at all. Thanks. Other questions?
So in some qadis, like the first qadi you mentioned, for example, the second qadi was very much against whenever a man brought up the idea of khuluu. Well, would the first qadi at least entertain the subject, or would he also say, the woman has to be the one?
You mean if a man asked for it? Yeah, more so. And so what he would, I've written about that a little bit more. And so one of the things that would happen is that, so divorces in the first court are much more likely to end in the khuluu. And sometimes, and sometimes the husband or the family would bring it up, and he would basically, it wasn't like he was entertaining. I mean, I never saw when I was working there a man coming in saying, I want a khuluu. I mean, if he wanted that, he would just write her for money, and he would divorce her unilaterally and say, pay me for this divorce, because that was effective. I mean, often women would do that, so there's no need to go to court. But usually what would happen is if it would come up in the deliberation. So if a man wants a divorce, he doesn't need to go to court. But if in the course of the deliberations with the qadi and all the hearings after hearings, a man really wants to be married, and that's what would happen usually. He really wants to be married. His wife does not want to be married at all, and so then that's when khuluu would come in, and she would be determined to be at fault because she didn't want to go back to her. She'd usually left him. She didn't want to go back to him, so that was breaking down the marriage. And so then what would happen is they would deliberate what the compensation rate would be. And so one thing, not in this article, but I've written about previously, is how the first qadi would allow, so again, according to most legal scholars, you cannot give more back than you received in the mahari. So you give, and if you do, it's unlawful. And this qadi, he agreed that it was technically unlawful, but he also agreed that it was fair in some cases. And so what he would do is he'd have people, like if it was you and your wife, he'd say, okay, you're saying, I know I paid her, 100,000 shillings in mahari, but that was 20 years ago. I would like to remarry. That, who knows what argument you're making, but I think 200,000 is more appropriate now. I mean, that would have been a huge amount. But so the qadi would say, okay, you and your elders and the wife and her elders go outside the courtroom and talk about it. And so you could do that, but it had to be outside of so he thought about that as kind of an extra legal arrangement that you would make privately outside of the courtroom, and then he would affirm it when you came back in, but it wouldn't be written down in the court records that you got twice what you paid in the mahari for paid, that's a horrible term to use, but that you were compensated twice what you gave your wife as a gift, for example. So he wouldn't put it in the court records like that. And so this is something, and that's, one of the other qadis knew that he did the other qadi knew that he did this, and he'd say, oh, Shamba qadi. Shamba is a term for farmland, and he'd kind of accuse him of being this like rural hick who was so willing to capitulate to the wishes of the elders, in some ways, he was the first qadi was very much a part of the community that he worked in. He'd grown up there. He'd studied on the Tanzanian mainland for a while, but he was part of that community in a way that the other qadi who lived in town and had studied in Saudi Arabia, he wasn't Saudi, he was Zanzibari, but he was a city qadi, and he commuted to a rural court, and so he would, he'd criticize the rural qadi or the Shamba qadi of being so willing to just address local norms or just kind of do what the elders wanted or incorporate local norms that he perceived as inappropriate in an Islamic sense. Did that answer your question? I realize it was a very long answer.
At least in the first qadi's case, they were more than willing to use these kind of extra legal structures when it was practical, even if it was outside of the Islamic law.
And it wasn't even so much practical, but he thought it was fair. And so I worked with him for a really long time, and we talked for a really long time, and he would talk to me about how he thought, this is, and he would say sometimes, he's like, this is Africa, and we have our own way of doing things. And he'd say, this isn't Iran. I would use the case of Iran. He's like, this is not Iran. We have our own way of doing things. And certain aspects of the law are appropriate for Africa, and that we don't do things the same way they do in, say, Iran or I think those are his examples were Iran and Saudi Arabia. And he's like, we don't do things that way because this is Africa. And so he would say certain things are appropriate. And there's no Islamic criminal law, but that was one example he'd always bring up. He'd say it's too heavy for Africa. He said we would never use this. It doesn't fit the African context, and the term he would use is too heavy. We would never use Islamic criminal law here. So, but great question. Yes.
Thank you so much. Just a quick comment on the Egyptian constitutional law. Following the 2014 constitution and the 2001 law, it mainly observed what the Sharia had traditionally held, so that the mu'akhar was only the responsibility of the man, right? So if there was an institution where he would be paying a certain amount of money after he would give the divorce unilaterally from his perspective, then that same imposition would not be the same in the state of khul'a. In the state of khul'a, if the khul'a was that he would not have to pay the khul'a back, then the wife would not be able to ask for the khul'a, but she's not responsible to pay that. And also, if the ruling of the khul'a was that he forgive or that she forgive him from paying it, because it's the exact same circumstance, she's also never responsible. So it's always that she's never responsible.
Great, thank you for that.
Divorces are so common, as you say, in India. These courts must be very busy places. Or further, do they deal with any other issues such as inheritance disputes?
Yes, that is a great question. They're busy, but so many divorces happen outside of the court. I mean, the most common form of divorce is a man repudiating his wife, and it's really hard to get because most people don't register them. So in terms of, I can't give you any statistics on how common that is, but they are pretty common. The marital disputes are by far the most common. In the rural courts, there are very few inheritance cases, but I'm glad you asked that because that's what I'm planning. I'm hoping to go back this summer finally after a long absence, and that's what I'm going to be looking into. I have a few inheritance cases that I've collected from prior work. I've never written about them, though I'm going through some of that material right now. I did a conference paper last year on the inheritance disputes. But yeah, there are very few. I mean, maybe every year, 2 or 3 in the rural courts. And I asked about that frequently, and people would kind of make a joke and say, we're very poor, we have nothing to dispute, so we never go to court. And most people, so I haven't done a lot of research yet on inheritance, but that's what I'm hoping to look at in terms of, well, we can get into that more, I guess, another time. But very few inheritance cases end up in the court. I mean, people inherit things, obviously, but usually they're taken care of outside of the court. So, but the court would look into inheritance cases if it was a dispute over who the heirs were. So if it's a dispute over property, it's like, do you have rights to this farmland, or does he have rights to this farmland? Then that would go to the secular courts. But if it's a dispute over heirs, that's what. And so the cases that I saw regarding inheritance were always disputes over heirs. So who was an appropriate heir, and that was usually what would end up there. So if someone claims that he's the son of your father, but you've never seen this person before, that would be then the qadi's job to decide, to figure out if that person was really an heir. So those, again, the few inheritance cases I've seen, it's always, I think everyone was a dispute over heir. One was a dispute where women were disputing whether or not, some men had tried to claim property that had been women or the use rights to property. The state owns all the farmland, most of the farmland in Zanzibar. People have use rights, and so men were trying to claim women's rights to certain farmland, and so they came in to determine that it had been inherited properly in the past. So that was another one that I've seen.
Was there any case you saw about husbands who went or used physical violence against
That
their
is a criminal. No, that's a criminal case, and so that's a great question. So that would be, so often women came in, and in a long litany of complaints against their husband, they would mention the physical abuse. I mean, it wasn't, well, I shouldn't say it's often. I mean, a few women did that. So, and how they would determine it, and so basically before you open a case, you have to go in and talk to the court clerks, and the clerks discuss with you what's going on, and then they tell you whether or not you have a case that the qadi can hear or should hear. I mean, and they were always, they're very strategic and very helpful to the litigants. They want to make a good case, and they're the ones who set out the case. So they get the story from the man or the woman bringing the case in, and then the clerks are the ones who prepare the claim for the qadi and set it out in the appropriate legal language. The litigants are invited to prepare it, but they never do. The clerks always do it, and they should, because they know how to set up a case. Well, that's my opinion, I guess. But what they would do, if a woman came in and physical or verbal abuse from her husband was her primary claim, then they would send them to the police. So verbal abuse and physical abuse is a criminal matter in Zanzibar. And so if that was the primary claim against the husband, they'd send them to the police, and then they would be opening a criminal case against the husband. And that's a different court, so I didn't study those at all. However, if the abuse was kind of, the fifth complaint she had against her husband, and again, I very rarely saw claims of physical abuse. It was almost, I can't even think of one. I might have one or two, but it was almost always verbal abuse. Her husband was insulting her, using really foul, calling her a slattern or a dog or something like that. It was abusive language. If that was one of many other complaints and wasn't determined to be the primary claim, then the Qadi would hear that. So the way that the clerks would set it up is they'd say, so-and-so, BB, which is Ms. So-and-so, Erin's opening a case because, number one, her husband hasn't maintained her or the children for 3 months. She's not getting enough food. Number two, their house is in a state of disrepair. Number three, he uses foul language. And so then it would be a case for the Qadi. But they would, if verbal abuse was the primary, or physical abuse certainly, that would be a criminal matter. And they would send them to the police, and they would open a criminal case.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, either one. Yeah, go ahead.
John.
So thank you very much for your presentation. So you mentioned that a number of divorce proceedings are happening outside of the courts. What sort of mechanisms or actions can court authorities take to keep the proceedings happening within the courts? And are there any repercussions for finding out that these proceedings have happened?
That's a great question, and they can't really do anything. So the Qadis would lament that in Zanzibar, men can still legally divorce their wives through repudiation outside of the court, and that is a lawful divorce. They would often complain, and other religious scholars would as well, that men do this like at the drop of a hat, and and then the Qadis would say that they can do this, but only under certain circumstances. They can't just divorce one wife because they see someone pretty walking by and they don't want to support two wives. They can't do that. It's not lawful. It's not appropriate, but there's nothing we can do about it. So it's really just God will judge them for that. And so that was kind of, that's something that came up a lot, because one thing I've written about is what I call disputed divorces, where a husband and a wife end up in court and they dispute whether or not a divorce actually took place outside of the court. And so a wife will think that these certain things happen and she's divorced because there are these structural things that happen with a divorce. And often, women will be divorced and they'll never hear the pronouncement, or they'll never, maybe they haven't seen the paper, but they're witnesses to it, so it counts as a valid divorce. But so there are all these cases of dispute where a woman comes in and says, I think I've been divorced, or I've been divorced, I want my certificate. And then the husband comes in and says, I didn't divorce her. And then, we got to open a case. And so, you have this thing when the woman says, well, you kicked me out of the house. You put all of my stuff, all of those household goods that I brought into the marriage, you put them all outside on the front porch. That is what happens when you divorce. You told me to go back to my mother. Like, that is a divorce. And because those are the structural things that happen with a divorce. However, unless there are witnesses that he actually said the words or wrote down a divorce statement, then it doesn't stand up as a legal divorce. And so, but in terms of, no, the Qadis aren't going out and visiting villages and giving lectures. I mean, teachers are and stuff, but yeah, and again, I can just speak for the ones that I've worked with, but they lament that is a big problem and that men are abusing their power to divorce, and they really think that's a huge problem, but they've kind of what can I do about it? I can't, we can't, they have the right to do that, and it's a valid divorce. Like, even if, he did not have a good reason to divorce his wife, and just, didn't want, wanted to marry somebody else and didn't want to support two wives or whatever, then so there's nothing we can do about it. So, and they would just kind of leave it to God to handle eventually. But did that answer your question? It's a great question.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks so much for this really informative, interesting presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.